I have a marketing framework idea called Stairway to Heaven, but the idea was just when you're dealing with something that's technologically innovative, the early adopters are all over it, but the majority are not. So you want to show them kind of a stairway of saying, well, here's where you are today. Here's probably your next step. There's really, really good material on various stairs in the staircase. Like the first stair is physics. And there's some really cool stuff about microbiology and all the COVID mRNAs. I mean, all this stuff is going on. And then I had all this humanities background. So I sort of had a lot of pieces, but those disciplines don't talk to each other. And so they were kind of siloed together. And I thought, well, if you're going to build a coherent picture of reality, you really need to draw on all of them. And the claim of the book is each stair's in the right place.
Aloha, and welcome to another episode of the Groundswell Origins podcast, where I connect you to outstanding humans and sustainable ideas. I'm your host, Scott Martin. Today's guest is the one and only Geoffrey Moore. He is the author of Crossing the Chasm, Escape Velocity, Inside the Tornado, and many others. He has been somebody who I've followed my entire career, and his most recent book, The Infinite Staircase, is a really intellectual sort of look at basically what is the framework of human existence, using physics, chemistry, biology, social sciences, humanities, everything. It's a metaphorical ladder that really kind of ties it all together. So it's a really deep, in-depth. I really had to hang on with all my fingernails to really keep up with him. But the first half, we kind of do a deep dive with that. And then we kind of, cross the chasm literally and talk a little bit about his sort of point of view in terms of the future of marketing. So total legend. Couldn't be more stoked to share this episode with you. And without further ado, let's paddle in. All right, we're paddling into another episode. We're here with the one and only Geoffrey Moore. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here, Scott. Appreciate it.
So the first question that I have is this book that you just recently wrote. It's an interesting title, The Infinite Staircase. What the universe tells us about life, ethics, and mortality. What made you decide to write this book? It seems like a pretty big departure of your previous books.
That would be true. I think, so what did stimulate me? I think part of it's been, I've done a lot of reading in a bunch of areas all my life. I read a bunch in physics. I read a bunch in biology. I'm an English major. I read a bunch in literature. I got fascinated with Darwinism and the social sciences, and at various times in my life. And I kind of try to incorporate some of that into my business books, and particularly Darwinism. I think had a pretty big influence on how I thought about markets and how markets evolve, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole intellectual backlog was just sitting there, and then I get older, and I'm 75 years old. You're thinking, okay, I'm in the fourth quarter of the game. Do I want to write anything at this point about where we are in the game? And I kind of did. I wanted to step back and say, so. What do you think? What do you think you've learned? And so the two questions I was going to try to answer were, what's going on? I mean, if philosophers would say, what is reality? I would just call it like, what's going on? And then second of all, and build on the science stuff. I mean, use the science as a foundation for that. And then given that picture of the world, which I was just piecing together from various bits and pieces that I'd read, how should we act? What's our ethical position in that world? Because ethics used to come from religion. This narrative was not a religious narrative. So now what? So it was whenever I write any book, I try to think about a problem that I think is really interesting and I do not know the answer to, and then try to use the book as a way of building an answer to it. So that's what I was doing with The Infinite Staircase.
So for those of you that are listening, many of you know exactly who Geoffrey Moore is, but maybe let's take a step back, because I'm curious, did your previous writings inform any of this going forward? And if you could, just tell us a little bit, just a quick backlog of your history and the books you've written, and then maybe bridge the gap, if there is one, cross the chasm from marketing to metaphysics.
Okay, deal, deal. I'll try to do this pretty quickly. But a lot of people don't know this. My first career was as an English professor. I have a PhD in medieval and Renaissance English literature. And I had really strong interest in humanities and narratives and how narratives inform our lives. And that is going to carry over into marketing because marketing, as you know, is really about narratives and stories. So it's a whole lot about it. Um, I was a professor for 4 years. We were in a small college in Michigan. We wanted to live back in California. We just made the move. And there were no openings in academics, so I got a job in a software company. And that subsequently led to jobs in sales, which I was good at opening and not very good at closing. And that turned out to be an opening for marketing because marketing is mostly about the opening part. So that was where I kind of found my niche. And I joined a company called Regis McKenna, which was the premier high tech marketing firm of the 80s. And that let me see a lot of clients all at once because virtually every major tech company was there at one point during the 5 years I was there. And that let me write my first book, business book called Crossing the Chasm. And Crossing the Chasm is still in print 30 years later. I've had to update it twice because you need to bring in all new company examples so that people can relate to companies that they're familiar with. But the book hasn't changed. It's sold over 1 million, maybe close to 2 million copies. It's been in a lot of different languages. It kind of was my claim to fame, my version of,
I have a
you know,
copy right here.
okay.
My original copy. I just looked at it and I found in there when I did my .com startup, it has the business card. I'm like, I haven't seen this for years. My VC actually made me read this. This is part of the required reading. And I think that's across the board. Anyone in .com, this was the Bible for
So
sure.
okay, so that was
Sorry, I didn't
Crossing the
interrupt you,
Chasm.
but I'm like, yeah.
No, no, it's great. Well, thank you. So anyway, so that was kind of my I can't get no satisfaction song. That was my hit song. So then it led to a subsequent books. There are actually 8 business books. Um, they are all backward compatible though, which is kind of interesting. Meaning the second book is compatible. The second book is called Inside the Tornado. Was okay. You've crossed the chasm. Now, how do you deal with hypergrowth? The third one was called The Guerrilla Game. It was about investing in high tech. Book. Each book was trying to take on a problem that actually had come to light in light of the prior book. So you work with a book. What happens when you write a book is, as you know, you people say, well, you should give a speech about that. So you say, okay, I'll give a speech about that. And then somebody at the speech comes up to you and says, this is really interesting. You should come and talk to my company about this. So you come and talk to their company about that. And they say, this is really, we'd like to apply your ideas, but you should help us do that. So you say, okay, I'll consult with you. So now you're doing a consulting project. And in the middle of the project, they bring up a whole bunch of issues that you had no idea, never covered in the book. Where it's like, oh crap, I, I gotta, I gotta write another book. and so it's and then
So they were
it
built
starts.
on each other. Is that the way to
Yeah,
say? Yeah.
each book essentially grew out of limitations or things that came to light in the light of the prior book that didn't get answered properly. And so it just
Beautiful.
was kind of a cascading set
Is it
of.
kind of like a staircase?
It's kind of like a staircase. Of course, I'm really into staircases. Even before the infinite staircase, I love a marketing. I have a marketing framework idea called Stairway to Heaven, which by the way, if you use, you end up getting rock songs for the rest of your life. But the idea was just, when you're dealing with something that's technologically innovative, the early adopters are all over it, but the majority are not. So you want to show them kind of a stairway of saying, well, here's where you are today. Here's probably your next step. Next step. It's kind of like what they used to call a maturity model, and you sort of put that out there, and it was always a staircase. And so staircases were always in the back of my mind. And then the thing that happened with the philosophy book, oh, and the last book I'll just say, Zone to Win, is crossing the chasm for people in large publicly held companies who need to maintain their existing line of business and still want to catch the next wave, which turns out to be a very different problem than if you're a startup catching the next wave. And so that was the last one. But then the Infinite Staircase came along, and what happened was I thought, well, these frameworks. I've been doing frameworks my whole life about how do you solve kind of tough problems with frameworks. Why don't you take on the toughest? Go big, go big or go home is what one of the recent books said. So that's what made me want to say, okay. And the problem was there's really, really good material on various stairs in the staircase. Like the first stair is physics. There's a ton of great about the Big Bang and astrophysics. And I'm not a physicist by any stretch of the imagination. So these are generalist books, but they're really good. And there's some really cool stuff about microbiology and all the COVID mRNAs. I mean, all this stuff is going on. Really good stuff about that. And there always was good stuff about Darwinism and how do you apply evolutionary thinking to development of people. And then I had all this humanities background, so I had a lot of pieces, but those disciplines don't talk to each other, and so they were kind of siloed together. And I thought, well, if you're going to build a coherent picture of reality, you really need to draw on all of them. And so the thing that pulled it all together was some ideas out of the Santa Fe Institute around what they call emergence and complexity. And their whole vision of reality is a staircase. I would use a staircase. They probably just say a set of emerging layers of complexity, each of which draws on what's below it, but also presents new properties that you could never have predicted from what's below. And so I tried to think about, well, how would you build a staircase stair at a time? And so there's 11 stairs in the book. And the claim of the book is each stair is in the right place. That you start with physics and you end with theory, and then so that was 2/3 of the book, which was just like, could you build a coherent picture of reality that sort of made sense and drew on the best thinking that I've been able to tap into. The bibliography's got probably, I don't know, 200 books in it. I don't know, a lot of books in it, because Kindles can hold a lot of books. And I stay.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, a Kindle is a gift if you sleep with someone and you don't want to wake them up in the middle of the night when you want to read. So that's when most of this reading gets done. Anyway, so then the last third, just to close, was, but I wasn't a liberal arts professor. I care about people, embracing ideas to make them live better. And so the last third was about ethics, and it was about how do traditional ethics, because I have a very traditional ethical system. I mean, basically, I wasn't a religious family, but I certainly inherited the entire Christian Judeo-Christian tradition, and kind of still to this day, I'm very loyal to it. But if how do you derive that from a Big Bang as opposed to from Genesis? And so that was, and then how do you authorize ethics, and what do they stand for? So that was the last third of the book.
So the ethics is interesting to me big time because you think about business and the importance of ethics and trust, and now more than ever in this world in business, like that seems to be something that's like maybe even a competitive advantage. Um, was there any correlation between the writing of all your business books and you outlining this, I don't know, framework of framework, and it being sort of like a playbook for really not just how to live your life and be aware of how the world works, but like how business can function? Or is it, I mean, that's kind of how I'm reading through it a little bit, but I'm
Well,
just like,
it's kind of prescient of you, because I would say that one of the relationships that developed in the last 10 years for me that had a big impact and ultimately I think led me to write the book was with Mark Benioff at Salesforce. And Mark sort of exemplifies the kind of business leadership you just said. So Salesforce does have a competitive advantage because of their ethics. They really do. Now, like anything else, you can become a larger company. You have to be careful not to take anything for granted, but it was there. And Mark lives his ethics out much more completely. I mean, I always kept the internal ethics separate from the external. I wanted to be ethical, but I didn't want to proselytize. I didn't want to I didn't want to be a guru. I didn't want to preach to the world. uh, and Mark doesn't preach, but he's out there with it. And I thought, he's showing up a lot more powerfully than I am in his area, and I could show up more powerfully. And he kind of challenged me to do it anyway. And so that's what led me. I say, okay, smart guy, so write the damn book. I mean, just do it.
mhm.
See what happens.
because because my interpretation of you is you look at these patterns, you see and demystify them, or the things that create possibility and create frameworks so people can really go, okay, I can understand it and I can actually move forward with it. So is this book in the same way? Can you describe like
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. This is, I mean, crossing the chasm was the very first problem was, why can these startups have, with these really cool products, have this amazing impact when they first launch, and then go off the radar? And like, what was going on? And because and so the first framework was called the technology adoption life cycle, And I just said, look, it's a break in the life cycle, people. There's this thing called the chasm, and the early adopters are on one side of it, and everybody else is on the other side. And crossing the chasm is a isolatable marketing problem that you need to understand how to do better because you're not doing it right. We're just losing everybody in the chasm. So you could kind of so now fast forward to this last book. Well, we have this really cool secular understanding of the universe, but we have a past political leader who is essentially debunking truth and debunking integrity and debunking honesty and debunking everything I stand for. And the culture has no obvious way to call him on it. And it's like that's not okay. So how do you authorize ethics in a secular culture was a very important motive for me to sort of do that. And so the idea behind the book is this is all about strategies for living, and ethics is a class of strategies for living that has been proved very successful in many cultures across many time spans, and it has authority by virtue of its prior success. And people who abuse ethics or have also shown up through history many times, but in general have not had the success and have caused an enormous amount of grief. And so, there's a way to sort of tie traditional ethics to a secular understanding of the world that is pretty credible. At least I've tried to make it as credible as I can.
Is this in conflict with religion in any way?
I don't think so. I mean, the key, the interesting staircase where this book comes together with religion is called narrative. And I make the claim, because I'm an English major, now be careful. I make the claim that narrative does all the heavy lifting for human problem solving. And so religion is a whole class of narratives. The challenge for religion in the modern day is religions tend to be based on sacred texts, and sacred texts are not to be modified, which means there's an inherent static element to a religious narrative that's becomes increasingly problematic. And what religious people do is they resort to allegory and interpretation and what they call hermeneutics. They find ways to try to keep it perennially relevant, and you can do that. But there's this other narrative that is incredibly extraordinary, which it starts with a big bang, which is just crazy, and the narrative of how you get from 13.8 billion years ago to Scott and Jeff talking, on a podcast. How do you do that without any miracles intervening? Is more miraculous than any religious narrative I've ever read. So I mean, but it's a narrative, and so that's where they came together.
Is there really just an intersection? I don't see one without the other, really.
Well, I think the thing about it's very interesting. I talk to a lot of people who say I'm not religious, but I am spiritual,
Hmm.
and I think that's capturing a lot of the modern challenge, the modern sensibility, at least. And I think I include myself in this group. Says I totally honor religious narratives, but I honor them as stories as opposed to honoring them as archaeology or as history. I mean, as sort of as science. And I don't like separating science from narrative because I think, and you and I both live in the world of, I mean, the world of marketing is the world of narrative, and so I didn't want to isolate it that way. Um, so anyway, but I also didn't want to trap the dialogue into you either have to. What I wanted to do is I said, could you present a case for ethics that did not depend upon religious belief? It didn't say you couldn't have religious belief, but it said, independent of religious belief, can you create this? Can you get to this set of ethics? And that's what I was trying to do in the last third of the book.
Beautiful. And like you've talked about, you draw upon Darwinism for a lot of business model thinking, correct? And one of the things is evolution, change, and as it pertains to business, it's always changing. And the one thing that struck me from your book was entropy and the idea of death, and it actually fueling um, sustain and growth and continuation. And this podcast is really about sustainable marketing or sustainable ideas. And I never really thought about what you were saying there, and it kind of struck me because if I think in marketing and business, it's like, is there an application for this, in this thinking? Because again, I'm kind of mapping it
Yeah,
back a little bit to my reality of marketing and business and trying
yeah,
to apply a little
yeah.
bit to your book. So forgive me. Um, but I'm thinking about like Volkswagen. the bug died and then it came back. You know what I mean? And so can you describe a little bit your thinking about entropy and
Well,
its
okay, so there's
application to
there's
this
two
and maybe
there's
business?
actually I think actually I would do let me do death instead of entropy because I think it relates more to what your point was. So the last chapter in the book is called Being Mortal. And it starts, of course, we're all born with a fear of death. I mean, that's kind of how mammals stay alive, right? But, I say, so is there anything that Darwinism could say about death that would be in any way, kind of a platform for going forward? And it's going to relate to the Volkswagen's death as well. And so I said, well, look, what Darwin says is that we're a product of evolution. And it says evolution is the result of natural selection, right? So we're here because of natural selection. Natural selection is the result of life and death competitions, right? So if there were no death, there would be no natural selection. If there's no natural selection, there'd be no evolution. If there's no evolution, there'd be no us. And everything that you and I experience, and none of it would exist. I guess we would have a world of just lots of bacteria. Because I don't know what it would be, but
Right,
it would.
because there's no
But
narrowing process to
exactly,
the most
there's
advanced. It'd be like a socialism for business, like all businesses treated the same, no competition to make it better.
exactly, and so therefore, you started saying, instead of saying death is the enemy, which we know as an organism, you really are raised to feel that way and be that way. And by the way, when you lose anybody you love to death, it's a seriously crushing experience. But if you step back from that and say, but hell, I mean, if it weren't for death, we wouldn't be here in the first place, which is really, I mean, I think embracing the truth of that sentence was an important moment for me. I thought, shit, there's no other way to get here. And so it's like, whoa. So I couldn't demonize it because that didn't seem quite fair. So then it was, well, how do you go at it? And that's where it gets back to Volkswagen too. So what I said about was, okay, so you're mortal. And by the way, as I said, I'm 75. I'm going to say a game, 100 minutes seems, 100 years seems like a pretty long football game. So fourth quarter, right? But you want to, you still still time on the clock, and you're still in the game. So what do you want to do? And I think what you want to do is you want to honor a legacy. At least I would like to leave a legacy. I'd like to have impact in a positive way. I think the Volkswagen people felt the same way. They had their first Volkswagen, my crossing the chasm thing, God bless, you know, and then it had its day, but then other things displace it, and then the question is, okay, now what are you going to do? And the thing is, when you've been successful once, you have a lot to bring back to the table if you have the energy and the will to do it. You have to sort of leave your ego at the door, but you can really have a big impact, and that seems like the best thing to do. At least that's certainly what I want to do.
Yeah, it's like they went back to the origins, which is sort of like going back and honoring the past, if you will. And that's a little cyclical. Um, in your sort of Darwinism theory, or in the, I'm thinking about the whole thing you said about desire. When I saw that on the staircase, I was like, I wasn't expecting that, because desire is like, can you explain that a little bit? Because,
Sure, it's okay.
and
So,
maybe give
yeah,
people a little context of the
yeah,
stairs,
yeah.
because
I'll
I'm
give the
kind of
staircase.
have the
So
ability of reading the book.
yeah,
So
okay. So the staircase idea is simply that each level of reality emerges from the one below it. So the bottom stair that I dealt with was physics. I said, look, 13.8 billion years ago there was nothing, and then there was just physics. And by the way, there was just physics for quite a long time. There wasn't chemistry can't happen until you have atom electrons bonding with protons to make atoms and chemical reactions. That doesn't happen until I think it's like 400,000 years. I mean, it's a while. Okay, and but then you get to the next most interesting thing for human beings is Earth. Earth shows up about 4.6 or 7 billion years ago. But interestingly, life on Earth shows up within less than a billion years. And so what was that life? Well, it was essentially bacteria. It's called archaeons, but they're like bacteria, single cell things. So you say, well, how the hell did that happen? And so that the first three was called the Metaphysics of Entropy, and I talk about how entropy is the force that unites those three. And it's a complicated argument, so I don't think I'll try to reconstruct it right now. And it's for geeks. If for those of you who are listening to this show, if you like geeky science, you're going to love this chapter. And if you don't, you should skip the chapter. But the next chapter, to what Scott said, starts with, okay, now you have single cell life on the planet. How do you get from that to you and me? And so the idea was, well, you have single cells. What happens? Well, they start creating these multicellular things that look a lot like tissues. And part of the way they operate is they signal to each other. In other words, one cell will emit a chemical that causes another cell to do something that helps the first cell. So they it's sort of like, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch my back. So that intercellular communication is the first inclination of something that I'm going to end up calling desire. And desire is simply the mind experiencing the intercellular chemical communication that's going on inside your body. And when you're a little baby, you have no language, you have no culture, you have no mental faculties that we would recognize as mind, but you do experience desire and you do experience fulfillment. And so the desire fulfillment thing is what then leads to consciousness emerging at some point. Because prior to, I mean, if you go back in time, I can have desire and fulfillment, but if I just do it blindly, which is how it began, at some point, if any organism gets any leg up on fulfillment over the other guys because they have any kind of, don't even call it consciousness, just one signal advantage. They can detect motion, they can detect they can do anything. They're going to beat out the other guy. And so they're going to, when we propagate their genes, they're going to be more of them and less of the other guys. And then
Is that when you
anytime
called it attention with or attention with intention?
yes, exactly. At
Yeah.
this point, what happens is your attention is born out of intention, and the intention is I need to fulfill the desire. And so conscious, and this, by the way, this is kind of what David Hume was saying when he said, "Look, reason is the servant of passion, not the master of passion." There's that idea of, look, desire pulls us into the world, and then we use our minds in order to fulfill desires more effectively and going forward. And then so that second section goes desire, consciousness, values, and culture, all before language. And it's an important idea because values, and this is where we tie into the second half of the book, values happen before language. And I make the claim that they arise in mammals, some degree in birds, but mostly in mammals, because mammals nurture their young. And so, what you and I, the first year of our lives, we experienced total dependence on another being. And that being every single day tended to our needs, or we wouldn't be here because you can't survive as a baby without that. So you are born, and by the time you're in your second year of your life, you have internalized what we call love because you couldn't be here if you hadn't received that. Now, you can receive it in all kinds of contexts, and some of which are unhappy, and there's all of the things that can happen. But anyway, the way mammals nurture babies, and then the social nature of mammals creates not only the relationship with the mother, but the relationship with the father, and then with siblings, and then with the tribe and whatever. But all of that is socializing values. And you see those values in deer and in dogs and in cats and in chimpanzees. I mean, you don't need people to have values. The early values are there. And even culture, like you see the monkeys teach how to use the twig to fish for the ants, and the whatever, the otters that crack open the mussel with a rock on their chest, or all that kind of stuff. Those are strategies for living that are learned not genetically, they're learned through imitation. And in other words, one animal sees another animal do it and goes, "Ha ha, that looks like a pretty cool idea." I mean, they don't say that, but they imitate it, and the ones that successfully imitate it create a tribe that have this as a behavior that they pass on generation to generation to generation. It's that tribe's culture. And so I wanted to make the point that values and culture, because those are kind of the core of ethics and at the core of how we think about ethics, arise prior to language. They don't. The sort of the payoff line is our values do not come from above; they come from below. And I wanted to show them emerging out. And then the last third of the book is then you get language, and then I call it going from the metaphysics of genes to the metaphysics of memes, ideas, and then that was the last third of the book.
By the way, that genes to memes. So when I
Yep.
read that chapter and I read it, I laughed because I thought it was kind of funny because you have a couple little funny points in several chapters, like your best defense, like the 85 Chicago Bears or something, maybe chuckle. So I read that and I actually thought you meant from genes to memes, like social media memes. And then
Yeah,
I read it, and then I laughed hard at myself because I'm like, well, of course he wouldn't say that. This makes no sense. But that's where my brain went right away. Just so you know, I thought that was kind of
well,
funny. I was laughing myself.
that's great. I'm glad. Okay.
So, anyways, okay. So we got this infinite staircase. Why is this important to know? Like, what? Sure, to thy own self be true, and to know the world around you. That's a really important thing. Is there a connection between someone who's been following you and reading you in your business? Could they apply this staircase to really like sort of like realign this understanding of the universe so that they can create more, be more? You
I,
talked about being, and
yeah,
I think that's just interesting.
well, let's set aside the chapter on being just for a second and go back to just the. I think the upper parts of the staircase are where people like you and I live with our clients. So basically, we live in a world which is incredibly language inflected, and to the point where often people have trouble getting outside of their own language box. And what mindfulness is about is finding a way to reconnect with the world without using language, because language can be so entrapping. And you have this whole tradition of French deconstruction, which was the ultimate in how to trap yourself in a language trap. It was just devastating. So anyway, but the two things above language I talk about in particular are narrative and analytics. And narratives are the stories we tell that intuitively solve problems, and analytics is criticizing those narratives in order to figure out which of those where is this narrative true and where is it not true, and where can you use it and where can you not use it. And if you think about business, I mean, everything in business starts as a narrative. There's a business plan. I have an idea for a product. I'm pitching a venture capitalist. When I spend my Mondays in a VC firm. So guess what? People come in and they tell you a story. And yes, there's a little bit of like there's a spreadsheet typically somewhere in that story. It's the least credible thing in the whole story. I mean, there's no facts for that spreadsheet. They just made up numbers. But what there is a story. And so the storytelling, so understanding, and I've spent the last 10 years in particular with clients saying, you need to be clear about your narrative. You enlist people through your narrative. You hold yourself accountable to the narrative. If you're worried about retention, if you're worried about talent acquisition, if you're somebody of my generation trying to understand millennials, you better get in touch with the narrative. And so that's part one. Then part two is, and you need to criticize the narrative. Every narrative is a limited artifact. It has its strong points and its weak points, and it's not okay to demonize the strong points, but it's also not okay to overlook the weak points. You really got, and so I would argue that literary criticism, but also marketing analysis, is about critiquing narratives to make them more effective. So yeah,
So then you have analytics and theory.
yes.
So tell me a little
The,
bit more about that.
the analytics part is the critical part. Then the theory is okay. Now we're getting to a level where you really have to be a theory person to want to do theory, because you can live perfectly fine and perfectly functional and be very powerful in the world and not have an ounce of interest in theory. But if you're with my particular disposition, maybe yours as well, it's like, yeah, but I would like to figure out how does all this fit together really. And so
Totally.
that's what I was trying. That was what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
Part of it was just kind of a reality check of, are you just bullshitting, or can you actually fit this thing together? And so the staircase was the mechanism, the framework for saying, and the claim of the staircase is pretty bold actually. It's saying there are 11 stairs. I didn't say that there couldn't be other ones, but I said these 11 are all part of reality, and they're in the right order. Meaning, every single stair in this staircase depends on the stairs below it and does not depend on the ones above it. And that turned out, half of the time you think, well, duh, and half the time it's like, really? And so that was I think that's what I wanted to get. The theory test was to sort of solidify that and see if that could hold.
Beautiful. This book is so interesting. I have to read it again. It's definitely like it's so well written, but for me, I just feel like I couldn't. I wanted to reread things, and I'm still trying to understand. Exactly like just digest. It's not a book you can just like rip through. I was on my Kindle, like you said, at night, and it's not a quick read, if you will, but it's an easy read to understand. That's what I love about it. So let's do a little bit of a turn,
Okay.
and let's just talk about, you've got this long career, storied career in marketing and with tech companies, and this great new book. And we were talking just before about this intersection of spirituality, business, and I noticed one of the things that you said in your book there is like you've tried, or you do, or you have done transcendental meditation. I can't even say what it is. What is it called again?
It's called Transcendental Meditation, or just TM for people that don't have to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So TM, what is that? And tell us a little bit about that, and then I got to follow up with a little bit of that.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think the contemporary word for TM is, the generic term is mindfulness. Transcendental meditation actually showed up in the '60s. There was a guy named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He became famous because the Beatles and Donovan and Mia Farrow and a bunch of people, bought into it. And there was a Maharishi University. It was so in the '60s. It had quite a big deal, and then it kind of faded from view. But Maria and I, we both learned transcendental meditation back in the '60s, and never stopped. So I've been meditating every day for 50 years. So it's doing so, and I think the way a person should think about that is like doing mindfulness. And mindfulness is typically done with your breathing. Anybody can do it. And the point about it is, when I was learning about meditation, I thought it was going to be hard to do. I thought, this is going to be like Zen, and it's going to be, the master, and only the most enlightened person is going to get this thing. It's actually, this particular transcendental meditation and mindfulness are the exact opposite of that. There is absolutely no way to get better at it. All you're doing is taking your awareness just to your breathing or to a mantra, to whatever it is, and just letting your mind go. And then a moment or two later, you're thinking about something. When you realize, oh, I want to put my awareness back on in TM they call it the mantra. In mindfulness they call it your breathing. Just bring it back to that, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing to it. But what happens is, over time, by doing this over time, is you get more and more familiar with the quieter parts of your mental experience, and I would call the pre-linguistic parts of your experience. And it's very it's centering. It has all those spiritual words that you hear about, that we all want. They all come from that place. And if you just do this stuff routinely, after a while, it's like, well, it's just part of you. And it's not, and because I love the transcendentalists and I love the romantic poets, but they were all about having these amazing experiences, which I totally resonated with, but they weren't accessible. I mean, it's like you couldn't plan them, you couldn't rely on them. And so what I loved about meditating was it was totally accessible and totally reliable, and it was like, okay, so that was huge. And that meant that the reason why it became the bridge, because I called that chapter "Being a Bridge to Ethics," because I don't think you can be ethical in the world and meet the challenges of being ethical in the world without spiritual energy. And so the main issue is, well, where the heck in a religion, it's obvious where you get spiritual energy from, right? You get it from God, you get it from prayer, you get it from whatever. But in a secular world, where do you get it from? Where does it come from? And so it was really important for me to have a chapter on here's where I think it comes
Mm-hmm. And in that space, so I meditate every day. I use Tony Robbins priming,
from. Okay,
which is a breathing exercise that he does
cool,
from Nepal. Do some special
nice.
breathing, and then you focus on three things you're grateful for. So it's a gratitude, and then three things you envision, sharing your energy to others, and then you end with three goals that you want to visualize. So it's visualization. So it's kind of a combination of multiple things. And I have found that over multiple days, that consecutively, now that I do it as a practice, it has opened up doors, which has been part of what you and I were talking about before we were recording, which is this movement of mindful marketing. And that's the guests that have been coming on, the things that have been just naturally. I've been on clubhouses, I've been doing rooms on mindful marketing, and I can't believe the level of interest in this intersection where people are going, I want to ethically build my business, but I want to do so in a way that's congruent with my values. And there just seems to be like such an appetite for this. That's why I think your book is just so amazingly timely right now, especially coming from you. When I saw this book, I was like, Geoffrey Moore, like, this is so interesting. Um, what would you say about what you've seen? Because you've seen so much marketing and business over this time, and you have a bit of a bird's eye view, I think, where you could kind of see where the trends are going and what's happening here.
Well,
Because what I,
it's so interesting because when I started marketing, getting in sales and marketing felt like Glengarry Glen Ross. Coffee is
yes,
for closers, and basically the implication was you kind of had to abandon some of the softer values if you were going to be successful at sales, in particular, and even marketing. You had to sort of you don't have to tell the truth. Tell them what they want to hear, and whatever. So that, and I would say that was, I don't think that was ever the only story in town, but that was I would say that was my received vision of, and certainly coming as an academic to business, that was totally my perceived vision. I thought I was joining the Philistines. I thought I was going out among whatever. So then fast forward, or not fast forward, go forward to the arc of my career in business has been about 40 years. What's happened is you've gone from a sales centric, product centric, sell them whatever it is, and then get out of town, to a subscription oriented economy where retention and customer success has become incredibly important. In fact, the function customer success used to be called customer support, and prior to that, it was called tech support. It shows that at the beginning you would sell them anything, and the tech support guys had to do whatever they could to make it work, but the customer owned the monkey. The customer had to get value out. Now we've gone all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is if your customer is not successful, your business is going to fail, because in a subscription model you cannot afford to acquire a customer and then lose them. You really have to have a long what they call LTV, the lifetime value of the customer. So all of a sudden, how do you keep a customer? Well, it turns out all these values that we're talking about are values that keep customers. And all the violations of those values can get customers faster. In other words, that's why it worked in the 80s. You can get a customer faster, but you can't keep them. So you have to lock them in. So the 80s, 90s thing was get a customer, lock them into your architecture, and then abuse them for the rest of time. and the new one is no, give your customer, bring your customer in, with open kind of any freemium, open, anything you can do. Let them join you gradually, but then treat them in a way that makes them not only want to stay with you, but actually want to evangelize you. And so
mhm.
then you go to the point of these people are actually working, but that only happens, as you said when we were talking before, when you're in a community of trust and a community of mutual respect. And so that's why I my as a citizen of the United States right now, what I'm so upset about is watching the systematic spreading of distrust as a political technique to retain power. And by the way, as we know, this is a very powerful technique. It has worked in the short term. It's worked very powerfully in the past. In the long term, it's been horribly disastrous for every society that's embraced it. But in the short term, it's a very, very tough um, uh, opponent.
Yeah, very a lot of things you said there, and the one thing I would just say is I actually have some familiarity, even though I'm from Canada, because I actually worked on Tulsi Gabbard's presidential run campaign and got a
Uh-huh.
real taste of some of this misinformation and some of the things you're referring to. When you're talking earlier, you were describing a little bit about mindfulness and the shift towards subscription models. And to me, I'm writing a book. I didn't mention that to you, called Groundswell, and the chapter I call it is we're shifting from buy to buy in, where people want to
Yes.
buy into you and the values, and they're not no longer transacting on the value of the product. They want to know what you're doing with the profits of the company. They want to know the values that you espouse as a company, and people are now not buying on price; they're buying on values. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, I think it's a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In some societies, I'm sure they're just buying on price because I just need it to survive. But as you move up the hierarchy of needs and get into more developed economies, self-realization and actualization becomes increasingly important. And in a self-actualized individual, everything you said is incredibly important to them because they want their whole life to reflect their values, and not in an egotistical sense, I mean, I'm sure there's that too. There's the, I have the brand genes that you don't have. That I'm not trying to do a Kardashian. I'm
Hmm.
talking more about people who say, look, I think people have embraced their own mortality, maybe not as consciously as I was trying to do in that chapter, but I see all of this as, look, we're not going to be here forever. We need to live our lives in a way that honors our own lives, and we want our children to respect us, and we want our grandchildren, and we want our parents and our grandparents. So I think that all of that has both familial impact, but it also has market impact. I mean, back to your point, and some of it is a little bit superficial. Like, we started interrogating the supply chain, and did the ESG metric of my supplier path. At some point, I think, come on, people, we're getting in the weeds here. Stay closer to the principle and the more immediacy of it. But the immediacy of it is, do not make me embrace values I don't believe in order to use your products or services. And I think we did. I think for a long time. Well, I mean, yeah, we know that cheap products were being created in parts of this world through slavery, or the moral equivalent of slavery, and that is wrong, and we should not support that.
I'm not sure if you've heard this quote. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly. It's being an entrepreneur is really a self development journey masked as a profit expedition. And you know what I mean? Something like that.
Oh, I love it. Yes, because so much. Most of the creative energy is actually in yourself. Now, it's not. It has no value until you can put it into the world. But and if you're going to be, and part of the entrepreneurial personality is they just need. It's like an artist. An artist needs to express themselves in their art. Well, an entrepreneur needs to express themselves in their entrepreneurial endeavor. And what's wonderful, and sometimes ludicrously so. I mean, you see these entrepreneurial ideas and you think, do not try this at home. But it but it's the human spirit,
Yeah.
and you think, God love it.
So my lead to that is business a spiritual journey? Because are we moving away from, like I said, the Glengarry, Glen Ross, sell it at any price, to really businesses are there to make the world better and help people and help them become their best version of themselves? Is that, I like to believe, I'm an optimist, but I kind of like to believe that.
Well, first of all, you're acting on that, and I'm going to act on that. You and I would not take on a client or do a project which contradicted what you just said. We just wouldn't do it.
Hmm.
And I think more and more people are of that persuasion. Is there a way in which you can do business that completely, blows up everything you and I've just said? Yes, there is. Yes. And is it powerful? Yes, it is powerful. So I'm not trying to say that there's a not optimist versus pessimist, but there's a wonderful line in a poem by E. E. Cummings about Olaf. He's a conscientious objector at a time when the conscientious objectors were just despised, and so they're just brutally persecuting this person in this poem. But there's a line that he says, "There is some shit I will not eat." And I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about the political situation in the United States right now, and I'm thinking there's a large number of people that I don't know that they can say that sentence. And but you and I, but I think a large of the people that we want, the people, person I'm trying to be, the person I think you're trying to be, and I think the people that are listening to this podcast in general are trying to be, is, well, there is for me, and there are a lot, and it's important. And it's not the only. I mean, the most important thing is what are the things you're doing. It's not what you will die for, but what you will live for, right? I mean, that's the most important
Hmm.
thing. But there are guardrails, and those guardrails I think have to be respected.
Yeah, it's like Simon Sinek, if you need to stand for something. It's not
Yes.
that you're always going to live in this like perfect ethical bubble, but at least having something you're standing for that people want to get behind. And that is what I'm calling this like unseen wave of marketing, this groundswell, because it's a pull. Like in a lot of the marketing that I've experienced, like I look at the .com era and how many dead bodies there were, because it was all about this rapid, fast growth. And nobody talks about, and not everybody, it's not a very good book statement. the general lexicon or conversation or thinking then was fast growth equals growth, period, not healthy growth. But then you look at now at some of the businesses like MicroStrategy, they were slow and steady growth, and look where they are today. Like, and so I was curious about you've been part of this, that whole
Yeah.
curve.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for me, having been part of startups that died and all this kind of stuff, that's why I'm sort of really so focused on sustainable, healthy growth, and how it can create exponential outcomes if you do certain things that are maybe not sexy and maybe they're a little slower. And it kind of ties in with a lot of what you were saying in your book, which about ethics and morals and so forth being sort of like a natural compass. And I'm just
I think,
curious, in closing,
yeah.
a little bit
I,
more of that. Your thoughts?
yeah, no, it's good because I have a friend who used to call the time right before the bubble popped the time of the great happiness because
Yeah.
everybody, because everybody's going to have a foundation to deal with all the wealth they were going to have. So at that, I think there was a period, and I think bubbles are characteristic of this, where people are trying to score. So they're not in service to the world. They're not in service to themselves. They're just trying to score. And so that's not evil, but that leads to bad outcomes. That leads to a lot of very disappointed failed startups. To your point, if you start something that I mean, there's two issues. One is what are you in service to, and is that worthy to be serviced to? The other, and by the way, that normally means what problem in the world would you like to try to help take off the table? Then there's the other question is what technology can you bring to the table that can change the dynamics of that problem to make it solvable. And so a lot of people come to entrepreneurialism with the second one. I have this technology. What should I use it for?
Hmm.
Um, which is which is fine if they can find the first one. But a lot of the failed startups come with the second one and they never find the first one. So they have this technology, but they can't ever quite figure out how to make it meaningful to the rest of the world. A bunch of people come with a bunch of NGOs come to the world with the first one, huge list of problems to solve, but they don't come with the second one. So they actually they raise money, they do everything, they try to palliate, they do everything they can to help, but nothing they do scales. And so what has been so exciting to me about the tech sector in particular in my lifetime is tech scales. And if you take an entrepreneur who genuinely embraces there's a problem in the world that I want to put my life and my company in service to, and I understand technology and how to scale things. And I think, Bill Gates was the first person I ever met that actually blew my mind about scale. And then the Google guys blew my mind about scale. And then the Amazon Web Service blew my mind about scale. So my mind's basically in tatters because I just couldn't comprehend the scales that they were talking about. But now you're looking at people, I mean, like Musk and Bezos saying, well, actually, you want to manufacture in space. I mean, it's like, really? But the point is, there's a problem that they perceive, and there is a technology. And I mean, Elon Musk with electric vehicles is a really good example of this, where he just operated at a scale that nobody imagined. Just nobody imagined. And so that's kind of amazing when you have either one without the other. It's not that you can't do good work, but it's just not the same.
Hmm. Do you see like you're so intimate, or at least I'm understanding, anyways, with the world of venture capital because you grew up in Menlo Park or you did a lot of your
Yeah.
career there, and do you think VCs will look at this going, instead of going how much money will this make and how scale it'll be, is going how much impact on the world will this be, but not from a purely like doing good in the world, is that knowing that that could scale. If and let me just sort of kind of explain a little bit. Like I think about Facebook, you could say, oh, it scales, it's huge, it's massive, but ethical information management issues could implode it, right? It'd be
Yes.
like a black
Yes.
star in my mind.
Yes. Yes.
And
Exactly.
so, what I talk about in the podcast a lot of times is that there's all these technology, it seems easy, it could help you scale, but on the surface, but really underneath it, it's not sustainable. Because
Yes.
over time, if think of all the companies and businesses that are reliant on Facebook, they don't have any sovereignty. And I think sovereignty is one of the biggest issues for business, but tech that supports sovereignty, supports entrepreneurial sovereignty, I should say, is, I think, maybe a scalable idea. Do you think VCs see this, or do you think this? Or do you see this? Like, that's just
No,
my
I, no,
thoughts.
I think you're at the leading edge of where I think leading edge VCs are saying, look, I mean, John Doerr was the bridge who kind of said, we're going to do well by doing good, and that I think most VCs are kind of on that page, but you're doing something deeper, I think, which is that um, these this idea of sovereignty, this idea of institutionalizing venture change as a social power uh, that's funded through venture capital. One of the things you discover, by the way, is venture capital is much better at doing this than public capital. Public capital has so many restrictions, and the consensus driven thing, it just, unless you have a benevolent dictator, and we certainly have dictators and we certainly have benevolent people, but not very many combine the two. But in the absence of that, venture capital can actually, and private action can move much faster than government action. Government action, however, can amplify. So what you really want is a private-public partnership where the private leads, innovates, takes risks, and by the way, makes a ton of money for itself. But even at making a ton of money for itself, I mean, Tesla, Musk has made a ton of money for himself, but he hasn't made a million vehicles yet. And I mean, there's much more work to do. Governments can amplify that, and by the way, governments can also restrain it. I mean, as our friends at Apple and Amazon and Google and Facebook are now discovering, when you take away sovereignty, people react, right? And they're going to say, no, we're going to reclaim our sovereignty at your loss. I mean, that's why I think what you're saying is prescient, because yes, you can get to this scale, but just like you have tech debt, you can have sovereignty debt or social debt or whatever it would
Mm.
be. And Facebook is got to pay down a boatload of social debt. And by the way, Uber, is dealing with that as well. I think Airbnb has been pretty successful so far at staying on the right side of their social debt, but they gave a lot of thought to sovereignty and the sovereignty of their hosts as well as the governments. So I think you've actually got a really important idea there, and I think the political social dimension at the beginning, I think all you have to worry about is just your values. But if you are successful and you start to scale, at that point you have to think about, okay, I need to realize I'm scaling within a system, and I need to honor the system within which I'm scaling, and not just take advantage of the system. I think the worst in the bubble is when we co-opt we gamed the system, and you saw a whole bunch of key people coming out of with an MBA coming out of school wanting to game the system, and .com, and we have the PetSmart puppet and the whole thing. That was
I was right in there and at all the trade shows, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think that sting of that experience and just my career of working with clients, it's kind of left me with, like yourself, you know, what do I want to give to the world? What can I do? And part of this podcast, my book is really about being a little bit of a guide to what's possible, not necessarily what is. I see threads of it, I see patterns, and so to me, I'm really just interested in this topic. And your book really resonated with me. I want to read it again, and I invite all of you that are listening. The Infinite Staircase is um, it's a really intelligently written book. I mean,
so
Jeffrey,
when is Groundswell coming out?
so I'm actually got my draft
Okay.
completed. My first draft, I just sent it to like Don Peppers and Joe
Yeah.
Pine and stuff for review and comics. I mentioned them in the book. So as soon as it gets to editing, they'll let me know once they kind of make it, as you know, once they
Yeah,
once they
yeah, I
give
don't
that the go
believe me.
ahead, then I'll. But they're saying to me it's going to be late spring, early summer, which I
Okay.
thought was really aggressive. So I'm excited about that.
I'm well because one of the things, I mean, the reason I have respect for your work, and there's a lot of folks. I'm pretty good at stepping back, but you're pretty good at stepping in, and the world needs people to step in. so,
Oh, thank
so
you.
I want to thank you for your work.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey. I hope that this this is the beginning of us doing maybe a couple other future podcast episodes. And if you were so inclined, I'd love to give you my draft for comment. I'd be
That'd be great.
honored.
I would love to see it. That'd be great.
Oh, wow. Amazing. So with that, where can people follow you? Where would you like people to connect with you?
So I think LinkedIn is the most obvious place. There is a blog for the Infinite Staircase. I
Mind
think
you,
it's
your note says it's not really a blog. Is that right?
yeah, that's the one. That's the one. C'était pas un peep. Uh, and I think what I'm going to start doing there, I think I'm going to start doing is posting what's happened since I wrote it, and I've been talking with people a little bit. These kind of conversations is other philosophical topics have come up, and I'm at a stage where I just want to write. So I'm going to write a bunch of essays about. I'm writing one about aesthetics. I'm going to write one about free will, blah blah. I mean, they're just classic philosophical topics. If you're a philosophy geek, I think it'll be interesting.
Did you say
If not, I think
aesthetics?
yeah, we'll see.
Did you say aesthetics though?
Yeah, aesthetics. Yeah.
Okay, I got
So
it.
I
I
didn't
know I
talk
got
about.
it. We're trying to wrap up, but I want to know about that real quick. What's your thought there?
Well. So the issue with aesthetics is like people are trying to figure out where does you know it's very elitist. It's very about taste. It's all about art and whatever. And again, I'm trying to say our values come from below, not from above. And so aesthetics is all about getting back to what philosophers call qualia, these nonverbal experiences that are very intimate and very subjective for us. And most art history has tried to try to take it from the top down. We have a theory of art, and eventually we get to explain qualia. And all I want to do is use the staircase to say, no, people, other way around. You experience qualia first as a baby. Babies experience qualia, and then you learn to talk about them later on. So it's that kind of stuff. It's
Interesting. Well, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to connect you, if you want, to Pauline Brown. She's the former chairman of Louis Vuitton Group, and she wrote a book called Aesthetic Intelligence. I've
I would
become
love to see
quite
that book.
close to her, and I think you two would have a great
I
dialogue.
would love that. I would love that.
Let's do that. Okay. Thank you for being on the show. Did you have something else you want to add real quick?
No. I just want to say thank you for having me on the show. I really enjoyed the last hour. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm so grateful for your time and attention. So, everyone that's listening, thank you for being here. Again, this is another episode of the Groundswell Origins podcast. If you have a comment and you'd like to leave a voice, go to groundswell.fm, drop me a voice in my little voice pipe there, and go to my inbox and I'll send you one back. And until next time, mahalo.